Hello there, this is Instructor Paul, and in this lecture, we're going to talk about PowerShell functions. Now first, let's talk about what is a PowerShell function. And it's a block of code that have a specific identifier. Now you can execute blocks of code inside the function by calling its identifier. This allows you to avoid redundant blocks of code. So we can write a function that completes several lines of code, like renaming a specific file or creating a folder structure. And instead of having to do that over and over and over again for every file we wanted to rename or every directory we wanted to create, we could simply call that particular function name and it would complete the actions for us. So you'll understand in just a moment, but it allows you to remove or avoid redundant blocks of code. Now let's talk about the simple function declaration, or how to declare functions in PowerShell. We're going to first use the function command here, followed by whatever we want to name the function. And this can be whatever we choose. It could be my test function. I just called it my function name here. It's just an alias for the block of code that we're going to specify. Now we follow that by an opening brace, and then we have a closing brace. And in between these two braces is the actual commands that we're going to execute, or the block of code that this function will execute. Now we can call this function by just referencing the alias or the name that we created when we created this function. Like I said before, you can call this function as many times as we would like. Now let's talk about function scopes. A scope defines how functions are accessed. By default, if a function is part of your script, it's going to be available to the entire script. Also, this doesn't directly relate to function scopes, but variables inside of a function are not accessible outside of the function. Okay, so variables inside of a function also have a scope. If we look at this function here, test, we can see we identified it by test, and we created a variable called var, and we assigned that value to be variable value. Now, if we, outside of that function, attempt to echo the contents or output the contents of var, it will come back blank because you cannot access this variable var outside of the function. Now let's talk about function scopes. This is something that you're probably not going to have to mess with, but I want you to be aware in case you do need to change the scope of an actual function. Now you can declare the PowerShell function scopes that are going to be on this PowerPoint slide. Again, it's usually not necessary. First, we have a global scope. Now this will make your function available, or it'll be in effect when PowerShell starts. A local scope means whatever current scope you're using for your script, and it could be any on this list. Next, we have the script scope, and this scope is created when the script runs. Remember when I said any function you declare inside of a script is available to the entire script. So you can call that function at any point in your script after you've declared your function. And this is the script scope. Next, we have a private scope, and items in the private scope cannot be seen outside of the scope. And finally, we have the number scopes. This allows us to use a number like 0, 1, or 2, and these numbers represent a scope level above the current scope. So if we specify 0 as the scope of our function, and our script is using a private scope, then our function will also use the private scope. Now, if we specify a 1 as the scope, and our script is private, it will go one level above and use the script scope. If we specify a 2, then our function will go 2 levels above and use the local scope, and so forth. Now let's talk about how you can actually declare a function scope. First, we're going to use the command function, and then we'll use scope, and then whatever the name of the function we're going to use. So in this case, I'm creating a function called test, and I'm going to use the global scope. Inside, we can execute our code just like normal, but keep in mind, this does not make your variables accessible to the outside world. It just makes the actual function a global function. That is all we're going to talk about in this lecture. That is a bit of a crash course on functions. In the next lecture, we're actually going to open up the PowerShell ISE and create functions. So I look forward to seeing you in that lecture.